So there are two ways to talk about this time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. One way is to talk about it as the intertestamental period. The way most people talk about it today, most scholars, they talk about it as the Second Temple period, which means those of us that know, that are familiar, when we read our Old Testament, we know that David, you may remember, wanted to build a temple, but God said no to David. He said, "You've got too much blood on your hands." And so Solomon actually built the temple. Well, the temple stood until Israel was eventually sacked and destroyed. I think it was, off the top of my head, I think it was the Babylonians that destroyed the temple. They came in and destroyed the temple. I can't remember. Sometimes I get them and the Assyrians mixed up. But anyway, they came in and destroyed the temple. And then the Israelites were taken into captivity. First, it was the uh, the nation of Israel, and then it was Judah that was taken afterward. And so eventually, though, you may remember they returned to Israel, and that's cataloged, especially in Nehemiah and Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah talks about the rebuilding of the wall and the rebuilding of the temple. So the second period, Second Temple Judaism, is from the time that the temple was rebuilt after the Israelites came back until the Romans destroyed the temple in AD 70. So you've got this period between about 500 BC and 70 AD. And you may be thinking, Grant, I don't care about this. I don't care about the Second Temple. What on earth does this have to do with learning about angels and demons? Well, the reason that it's important is because this is the time period that Jesus grew up in. He grew up in the Second Temple period. This is the time period that a lot of these books, and particularly Enoch, was written right smack in the middle of it in about 300 BC. So it was written in the middle of the Second Temple period. And this was the time that the apostles grew up in, and the writers of all the books in the New Testament, all the Hebrew or all the Jewish writers, they all grew up during this time period. So when we read some of these passages in the Old Testament that don't make any sense to us, it's kind of like Revelation, right? If you've studied Revelation very much, you know that you can't really understand Revelation well unless you know a little bit about the Old Testament and a little bit more about the Roman Empire. Well, I think Genesis chapter 6 and even some of the things that we learn about in the New Testament are hard to understand without a grasp of kind of what they were thinking in that time period. So we often wonder what happened, right? What happened between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament? Did the Jewish people cease to exist? Did God quit caring about them? Did people quit writing? And what we know is that there are actually a lot of books written between that time period that we don't treat them as scripture, but we can find them really helpful. So I want to give you guys a little bit more background. And it's kind of like, how many of you have heard of Josephus? And you can just raise your hand if you've heard of Josephus. Every boring Church of Christ preacher I heard in my life has quoted Josephus at one point or another, including myself. I'm not putting myself above anybody, but we've heard Josephus quoted until, well, the reason that Josephus gets quoted is because he helps us understand a little bit about the background, the world that the New Testament was written in. Well, that's exactly what these books do that happened, that were written between the two testaments. I'm not going to go through the list. If you want the list, I can show you um, I've got a picture that I can send you that has the different books, or you can look up a Catholic Bible, look up the Apocrypha, and it'll show you the apocryphal books. But Enoch doesn't even appear there. It appears in what's called the pseudepigrapha, which uh, if I were to quickly explain it, it means that they don't know who the author was, or really that it was written in the name of someone else. So Enoch, no one is saying that Enoch wrote the book of Enoch, but it is written in Enoch's name. And so there's two ways to look at that. One is someone was basically being dishonest, and another, which was very common in the ancient world, was that they would write in the voice of these other people as a way to show them honor, as a way to kind of show them. And that's what most people think the book of Enoch was written that way. So in that time period, another reason that it's important is that Genesis chapter 6, and we covered this a little bit last week, where it talks about the sons of God looking down and seeing the daughters of men and thinking they were beautiful, and then they come down, they take them as wives, and you're. I'm not going to get too much into the details of that. That gets into my zone of discomfort, but you guys all know what that means when the Bible talks about that. And so they had children that were became the Nephilim, that were this kind of mixed race between gods and you know, really a good way to think of it. And there's actually connections, and we'll talk about this later. Is when we think of Greek mythology and we think of like Hercules is a famous that was half god, half man. That kind of it's not the same thing, but that helps us wrap our mind around it. So the Nephilim were born through that. Now the problem is that we don't have a lot of context around Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It just doesn't really make sense to us because we don't understand that world. And yet we have passages like in Second Peter and in Jude. Let me just read this to you guys real quick. Second Peter chapter 2, verse 1. But the false prophets also arose among the people, and in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Now, listen to this. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And then in Jude 5, listen to this. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved the people of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left the proper dwelling, he has kept them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. So in those two passages, we've got this example of angels sinning, of them descending down into the world. There is this tie with sexual immorality that's connected to the flood and then connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then it talks about them being put in chains in prison. Where on earth is Peter getting this? And where is Jude getting this? The answer is that they're getting it from the book of Enoch, which is one of these books that's in the middle. So when we think of Josephus, Josephus helps us understand what's going on in the New Testament world. The book of Enoch helps us understand what they were thinking. Now, the book of Enoch only made it into the Ethiopian church's canon, and yet it was preserved in all of in all of the big collections in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was preserved there, and it's quoted directly in Second Peter and in Jude. Now, this is why it's important that we understand this, and then I'm going to slow down and take some questions here. When we read Genesis, in the background of Genesis is Babylon. Like in the background, when we read the New Testament, is Rome, or in Revelation, the background is Rome. In the background of Genesis is Babylon. And there was this story in Genesis. And if you've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you may have heard of that. There's a flood narrative. All of these other ancient religions had flood narratives and things that are similar to the Old Testament. But the Babylonian kings believed that the gods came down from heaven and had children with earthly women, and that their kings were descendant from them. The Babylonian kings were descendant from that. And they also believed that the gods came down, and it was the gods that taught them the arts of warfare, the gods that taught them about building and about architecture, the gods that taught them these arts of seduction, which actually come up several times in the Old Testament down the road. But to the Babylonians, these were all great things that the gods gave them, the secrets of fire and all these, that the gods gave them those things. These were great things. These were the things that their kings had, right? And their kings had this royal lineage. And we think that like Methuselah lived a long time. He lived, what was it, 965 years? I can't remember off the top of my head, but he lived a long time, right? And then all of those guys lived a long time. That's nothing compared to how long the Babylonian king said that their kings lived. They said their kings lived like 10,000 years. But it was because they had this angel blood or this God blood in them. What Genesis chapter 6 does is says, Babylonians, what you're saying is good, and what you're saying is the seed of your power, and what you're saying draws you close to God, is the opposite of that. It is that very act that was evil when the watchers, when the angels came down, when the sons of God came down from heaven and they had relationships with the daughters of man. Not only was that not good, it was evil, and it brought about the evil, all the evil in the world. And so when we think of what is uh, when we think of the fall of man, and I'm going to let someone answer me here if you don't mind. What do we tend to think of? When we think of the fall, what do we think of?
Satan.
Satan. Yeah. Yeah. And what story? What story in the Bible when we think of the fall? It involves Satan or the serpent.
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. Yeah, that's right. We think of Adam and Eve being tempted, and Adam. I'm not trying to put this on Eve. That was an accident. It was everybody's fault. But them being tempted by that apple and indulging in sin, and sin coming into the world.
Adam did blame her.
He did blame her, and we've been doing that for a long time. Ever since, right?
But she was pretty guilty.
Yeah.
Yes, she was. He did eat it. So, nobody made him eat it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's all of our fault. None of us get off the hook.
But we've always thought that's where all the evil came from. And now you're telling us that they came down when they came down from heaven and had relations with when the angels came and they had relations with humans, that this is where the evil came from.
What I'm saying is that that's what Second Temple Jews believed.
Okay, that's what I need to know.
Yeah. Now they would have thought that sin came into the world with Adam and Eve. They would have thought that too, but they would have thought that the evil in the world and just this oppressive and continually raveling out of control had more to do with what happened in Genesis chapter 6 than what happened in Genesis chapter 3. Because when that happened, right, the order was breached in that you had the divine, the mortal and the immortal mixed in a way that they were not meant to be. As we talked about last week, they also had children, which were kind of unholy, that we'll talk about next week. This is what we're going to get into next week.
What happened to their descendants?
Well, that's quickly what they thought in the Second Temple was that they were the Nephilim, right, is what they're called. Or when you get into Deuteronomy, the Rephaim and the Anakim, which also, this is really interesting to me, are the Canaanites. Right?
Oh.
Yeah. And so, and they're all tall, right? And so we want to think. And so even like the Philistines, like Goliath and Gath, are connected directly back to some of these passages that would connect them to this unholy. So this unholy.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just God destroying other people. It is this remnant of something that's unholy. And so, and this is where it comes into the New Testament. We mentioned this last week, is that in the second temple, and it explains this in Enoch, which is one of the things we'll talk about next week, that when the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood and later destroyed in the conquest, that their spirits could not go back to heaven, right? Because they were not, that they were not part of the divine council, that had been breached, nor could they go to the Hadean realm with people. So they're stuck in the middle. And so when we see evil spirits show up in the New Testament and Jesus cast them out, it is these spirits that are left over from the Nephilim that can neither die like humans nor ascend back to heaven like the sons of God. So they're stuck. We'll talk about that a lot, but that actually, so when Jesus is casting out demons, it's not just that he's healing people and healing the sick. You see, the ancient Jews, they would have thought that all the sickness and the decay in the world happened because of this breach between heaven and earth, which says a whole lot about, now, what y'all have to stop me from is that I can sprawl really quickly, and I'm in danger of sprawling beyond my scope right now.
Okay.
But it's also helpful in thinking about the way that we understand purity in the temple, right?
Mhm.
The way that we understand why they were so careful, because the temple was this place where the space between heaven and earth was really thin, right? It was the idea that heaven and earth were almost connected in that space in the temple. Same with the Ark of the Covenant. And the Garden of Eden was the same way, right? It was this space, like the Garden of Eden was really God's temple on some level. He dwelled there, right? We know that. Same in the temple. So that's one of the reasons that they were so careful about who was pure, because they did not want to defile that holy space in the temple. So the idea was that these demonic spirits that are left over from the Nephilim, that's where they come from. It's not people that are out there that were just mean. It's this, the leftover, these Nephilims whose bodies died, but their spirit couldn't go anywhere. And that's why we read, like we talked about last week, that even if we take Jesus when he's tempted in the desert, the idea was that these spirits were more present the further they were away from where God was. So once you got outside of Jerusalem into the desert, into the wilderness, and it says Jesus was tempted, right? Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted by 40 days by wild beasts and by evil spirits and all of this. Well, that's where they thought that they were the strongest, was outside of the boundaries of the promised land, right? So there's all kind of interesting stuff there, and I've gone a little bit too far on that, but we're going to show next week how the book of Enoch helps us understand those things that was really difficult to understand for a while.
You
Any
should
other
read that
questions?
book, Rhonda, that unseen realm, and you would enjoy it.
Yeah,
Alvin.
yeah, it's really good. It's really good.
Is the book of Enoch a difficult book?
No, oh, thank you for saying that too. Actually, let's see. There is sorry, I've got books all around me from trying to put all this stuff together, so it's hard for me to put my hands in. This is a translation by Harmonia. It's a really, really good translation, and it's short. You can find them online too, and they're pretty good. You can read the book of Enoch, the whole thing, in a couple of hours at the most. It's not very long. And it really kind of lands in and really kind of,
Is it by a particular author?
no. I can send you the link, but if you
Okay.
can just remember Harmonia, that's hard to remember. Nicholsburg is the author. the translator rather, not the author. He's the translator. And this is considered the best translation of the Book of Enoch.
So,
Nichols Bird.
Grant,
Yes.
so Church of Christ preaches this, teaches this.
No.
I didn't think so.
Well, but let me say that it's there. It's just
Yeah.
one of those things that's been difficult. And some of this information was discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls. See, we just
Mhm.
didn't have access to this for a long time. Like this was the way everybody thought until Augustine, and Augustine didn't like he didn't like the Book of Enoch. He didn't like that interpretation. And Augustine, really from Augustine on, we have a real emphasis on the fall from the Garden of Eden as opposed to the second fall. But before Augustine, several church fathers, Origen, Tertullian, Irenaeus, these really famous church fathers thought that Enoch should have been scripture. Like that's how serious that they took it.
Okay.
And I think it's really important. And I say not Church of Christ. I think
Listen, I've heard of this and I'm enjoying this. That's not, just growing up in the church, I'm just thinking, why couldn't we have had this a long time ago?
yeah.
Why couldn't we have heard this?
Yeah.
We
Well-
were too busy debating.
Yeah. Well, and what we'll get into in later weeks is this helps us understand so many things. I think it, you know what they've discovered?
That's like we grew up with them telling us those demons were epileptics, explaining it in ways that the only reason the Lord turned the water into wine was because that's all everybody drank. It wasn't really alcoholic. It was just, I've heard all that crazy stuff all my life.
Let me tell you something about that wine that Jesus made.
I bet it was potent. I bet it was some of the best.
If you read it close, it almost looks like Jesus kept the party going. I'm just saying, if you read it close, that's kind of, I'm a little bit,
I agree.
but not totally tongue in cheek.
I agree. I am too.
Let me say this too, because this is really important when we look at these books. Sometimes, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, Rhonda, about the Church of Christ and why we didn't learn these things. The way I grew up, and my dad was an oddball. He read the NIV. That's all we had in our house. Back before anybody read the NIV, as soon as he came out, he got it. He loved it. It was the first Bible that he felt like he could read and understand. So I have an affinity for it too, because that's what we grew up reading in my house. He got it. He got the first version, the New Testament, that came out in 78, I think, or maybe even earlier. And then when they came out with the full in 82, that was all that he read. But we have this idea that the Bible just kind of floated down out of heaven in King James English, right? And that's
Right.
showed up.
I know better.
Yeah. But the truth is that it was not until 382 that the church finally settled on what books were officially in the New Testament, nearly 300 years after Jesus. So before that, different churches had collections of different books. And some of the books that we have in our Bibles now were controversial in the New Testament. And there were certain books that almost made it in. Revelation was controversial. 2 Peter was controversial. Jude was controversial. 2 Thessalonians was controversial as to whether it made it in. And then there were some books on the outside, like the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, that actually the Apocalypse of Peter, that debated whether or not they would come in. Now, let me say that I think we've got the right books. I just trust God in that. I trust that God made sure that we got the right books. But I think it's important to understand that there was a process of how these books got in our Bible, and that some of these early church fathers thought that Enoch was really important. And it influenced a lot of obviously it influenced the New Testament. 2 Peter and Jude both quoted directly from it. 1 Peter chapter 3, that really confusing passage, and I'm going to talk about this next week, where Jesus goes down and preaches to the souls in prison, the spirits in prison. You may remember that does not make sense until you read Enoch. And all of a sudden, when you read Enoch, it makes sense, because it talks about, it says in Second Peter about those angels going to prison in Tartarus, that is not anywhere in the Old Testament, but that's in Enoch, right? Enoch tells us more about what happened. And it also tells us more about the Mesopotamian context. Because remember, in Mesopotamia, they thought their kings were descended from the gods, and that's what made them different. That's what made them special. That's what made them better. Genesis chapter 6 says, no, the very thing that you thought made you better is evil, and brought evil into the world. And once the heavenly realm breached the earthly realm in such a way that such an unholy alliance was made, that's when the earth began to decay, and that's when evil was really set in motion. Sin happened in the garden, something was broken there, but the early church and the Jews in the Second Temple thought that the real evil that took the world off the rails happened in Genesis chapter 6. So they meet. Well, I'm going to read a little bit more, but I want to hold off. I really wanted to give this so that I didn't have to jump into this next week, so that we could really just kind of jump into what happens, because Enoch describes the meeting of these angels, what happens. It describes what I talked about with the Nephilim later on and the conquest, and it lays this out. And all of a sudden, several passages in the New Testament make sense. Now, I want to be clear, because I don't want anybody leaving here and saying that Grant said that Enoch is part of the Bible. I don't think that. That's really important. I don't think that. What I do think is that Enoch shows us what they thought. It shows us what Second Temple Jews were thinking. It shows up what Jesus was brought up, being taught and thought. And when Jesus comes in power and starts casting out demons, it is showing that he is taking authority back over these unclean spirits and over these sons of God, these fallen angels, these watchers from Genesis chapter 4 that have rebelled against God. He is showing that now he is calling all the people back under the authority of God, and that these spirits and these other demons / angels, they don't have power here anymore. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's going to make a lot of sense. Sally, I see your hand up.
Listen, I hear what you're saying, and I've read Enoch, and it doesn't, to me, read like the Bible. I mean, I see a difference in it, and I don't know what I'm looking at, but what I don't get is, if there's so much more clarification of what the Bible teaches, then how can it not be inspired? How did they figure? It had to have come from somewhere. The thoughts that they have.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with that, Sally. So I kind of get distracted in the middle of my own thoughts, because there's so much here, and I want to talk about it so much. With Enoch, I think it's helpful for us to think of Enoch like we think of Josephus, in that it helps us understand the background. But Josephus is sometimes not a trusted source, because even though he's Jewish, he worked for the Romans. The Jews would have considered Josephus a traitor. And I think it's important to recognize that about Josephus. What Enoch and these other, like the Maccabeans, and as Patricia talked about earlier, the Wisdom of Solomon, Judith, these different stories in the middle, they show us what the Jews were thinking and what they were writing about. But these were faithful Jews, right? These were Jews that were part of that were loyalists to the kingdom of Israel. They weren't like Josephus that had run off to work for the Roman Empire, right? These were the Jews that were brought up in this Jewish culture. So I don't think that it's scripture. I want to make that clear. And I think that it's important because it shows us what they were thinking. And I agree, Sally, there are parts of it that are bizarre in Enoch. And yet there are parts of Enoch that help explain some of these things that I don't know that we can really find anywhere else. So,
well, how did they get the knowledge? How did they get that knowledge?
Well, we're kind of getting in to the weeds a little bit. But like all, I'm just going to give you the theory that I believe when it comes to how the Old Testament was put together. It's kind of like it says at the end of John, if all the things that Jesus did were written down, all the books in the world wouldn't be able to contain it, right? We remember that verse. There are a lot of things that God did that didn't necessarily get written down. And the Jewish people were an oral culture for a long time. A lot of their stories were passed down orally before they were written down. My thought is that from Genesis all the way through Second Kings was not collected and formally put together. I think that the writings were there and I think that they were written down. I'm not saying that this is when they were written, but I think they were put together close to the time of captivity because they knew that they were about to be taken captive and they wanted to make sure they saved these writings for the next generation, right? So, and we all know that when they came back, that if they had not saved those writings, that they wouldn't even have the Hebrew language anymore because they forgot how to speak Hebrew. They forgot how to speak Hebrew 2 times, at least.
Were you talking about the Babylonian captivity?
Yeah. I'm talking about the
Okay.
Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian
Right.
captivity too. But the Assyrian captivity, we don't even know. It looks like the nation of Israel never came back intact at all. They came back. That's one of the reasons that they were rejected by the Judeans because they thought of them as turncoats because they had mixed in with everybody else. When we think of the Samaritans and the Israelites, they hated that they had not kept their culture pure at that time. So by the time of Jesus, they weren't speaking Hebrew anymore. They were speaking Greek and they were speaking Aramaic, which is what Latin. They had to take the scriptures that they saved and learn how to speak Hebrew all over again. So anyway, that's my thought. Everything was written down, but it's kind of like us, right? Everything that we know that's going on in the world doesn't get written down. There are pieces of information that get passed on to us person by person. I'll give you an example. My grandmother told me that, and this is how, there was a time where it felt like it was controversial for people to take a knee at church, and it may still be that a little bit. But my grandmother told me that when she was a little girl, this was back when I was a kid, that every man that got up there to pray kneeled down in her church when they prayed, and said, I've come to find out that was actually kind of a common thing. That's not written down anywhere. I don't know where that might be, but my grandmother told me that, and that was passed down from someone else. And all of us, if we were to think about it, you've got little pieces of knowledge. Miss Gail did such a good job of collecting some of our own oral history and putting it into a history of our church. Same way with the Israelites. Everything that happened wouldn't have been written down, but they carried these stories that they believe explained what had happened down through the years. And when Enoch was written, all of that stuff came in and helped them kind of talk a little bit more about Genesis chapter 6. Now, y'all ask me questions because I feel like I'm confusing myself as I'm talking. So there's a good chance that I may be confusing some of y'all. Maybe I'm not. Tell me what makes sense and what doesn't.
To me, even though I've not read any of those books, but they have great value in that they confirm and affirm the historic Jesus.
Yeah.
A lot of Josephus does, because didn't he write later in the 1st and 2nd century?
Yeah.
The history of Jesus.
Yep, that's right.
Grant, I've been reading, I've been reading some of the background and some of those things that took place in Genesis. And the writer will say there are legends that explain this. It's kind of like you said about the oral history, legends that they would tell why that happened, or come up with some story of why Cain killed Abel, other than just exactly what we know. But they would describe it, how he tried to get him to go out into a field and he crushed his head with a rock. They would make up stories about those events that took place. And they tell them so often that everybody believed that.
Yeah. Well, and you may have heard of the Talmud. You may have heard of the. I'm saying that wrong. And what's the other one? basically rabbinic teachings, the different midrashes, which are basically like these commentaries where these rabbis pass down these stories
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Jewish people have all this access to that we never study. And I think that it doesn't mean that everything that they say they have to believe, but it shows us what the people that were the closest to it thought. And I think that,
Thinking about it. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. And let me add too, that in the ancient Near East, like this is really important. They've done some studies, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that two things. So don't jump ahead of me before I finish what I say here. That an evolutionary way of approaching kind of the origin of everything is not just does not just explain to some people in academia how life began. Like they look at evolution to explain all things. And so when they think about religion, they think about people kind of gaining consciousness, and then they evolve from there into having like kind of, you know, seeing certain things as being like talismans and basically being superstitious. And from there, they develop into polytheists where they actually have other gods, and it moves beyond just kind of a local type pagan thing. And from there, they evolve into monotheism. Well, guess what anthropologists have found out? That it looks like it's the other way around.
Yeah.
That historically, that the further back they get, even in these ancient tribes, these indigenous tribes, it looks like they believed in one God, which devolved into multiple gods, which devolved from there into this superstition where all these different things were enchanted. Now, let me tell you why I think that that's really cool and important. In all of these other stories in the near ancient world, like you've got flood stories, the Babylonians had flood stories, the Egyptians had flood stories, like a flood narrative of everything being flooded. The Sumerians had a flood narrative. And if you read some of these very critical scholars, they'll use that to say, well, that means that the Bible is just copying these other stories, and that means the flood isn't true. My thought is that, you know what, if there was a huge flood like that, why wouldn't everybody have a memory of it, right? Why wouldn't everybody have a memory of something like that?
Right.
And if at one point everybody believed in one God, and then they rebelled against God, and God put these other, you know, the other members of the divine council over them, and then they rebelled, why wouldn't they have some memory, some stories that make connection to that? And so when you look at it that way, and you see the narrative of God being one, and then people walking away from God to these other gods or divine beings, then all of a sudden, I think that it makes more sense that way. And so when I kind of look back on these old stories, and I can't remember who it was, but these stories in the ancient world, I don't look at them as all being made up. I think maybe there's a kernel of truth that's there that exists because they were all people created in the image of God that walked away. And so now there's something that's distorted in what's going on. And so when you think about these other religions that are in these other areas, very often, even if you were to take ancient Greek religion, and there's a lot of connection there. As a matter of fact, our vision of Satan looks a whole lot like Pan. And a lot of people think that there's a connection to the way that we understand Satan as having hooves and like goat's legs and a goat head being connected to Pan in Greek mythology. Anyway, that's another story. But it looks like this story of people walking away from God and choosing to worship these lesser beings. So what if even there is a connection back to how we can trace, instead of it going from this polytheistic, superstitious religion to a more formal polytheism like ancient Greek religion or Egyptian religion, all the way up to monotheism. What if there's God? And when we see these other religions out there, we're seeing people that have walked away from what's going on and accepted some other truth. Now, that's just a theory, and I hope that doesn't sound too crazy. And I'm not saying that those are legitimate, but if everybody was connected at some point, to me, it makes sense that we can see the distortion that happens in all of these different religions that surround Israel. Y'all tell me if I'm crazy.
Well, it didn't stop with Christianity. I mean, well, that's not right.
Yeah. Well,
Still
but
still
Gail, let me say that it happens the same way. Like if you understand Catholic theology, they do not think that saints are gods, right? They don't think that. If you understand that, like we take it that way. But when it gets to the people and you get to some of these cultures, they start beginning to treat these saints like lesser gods.
right.
People tend to do that, right? We tend to naturally walk away from who God created us to be. Same way with these books, these intertestamental books. They were in the Bible up until Martin Luther decided to kick them out. Because even when the Jews put them in their Bible, or not the Jews, the Orthodox and the Catholics, they did not believe them to be authoritative scripture on the same level as the New Testament and the Old Testament. But what happens when something is in your book that you call the Bible, people eventually forget that, and they begin to treat those other books just like their books in the rest of the Bible. So Luther and Calvin and all these guys said, look, sola scriptura, scripture alone. We don't want to confuse anybody. This is the highest level of authority. It's a higher level of authority than the church, right? And so they kick them out of the Bible, not because they don't think they're important, but because they don't want people to get them confused with the books in the Old Testament, the New Testament. So as people, we just kind of naturally, if we're not really careful, find ourselves latching on to things that aren't true, right? And so I think you can even look, and I know that I've sprawled all over the place, but I think you can even look at these ancient religions, the ancient Greek religions, and even in those religions, you can find connections to where you can see that perhaps this is an example of how they have walked away from God and taken some of the things with them, but have celebrated the members of the divine council as gods themselves, these fallen angels, right, as gods themselves. That's crazy. I went too far into that. I shouldn't have done that. So I apologize for that. All right. Anybody have any other questions? Here's the main thing that I want you to pick up from this, that I want you to remember, is that there was stuff going on between the testaments. People were writing it down. And when we read it, we learn about the world that Jesus came up in. One of the things that was important to them between the testaments was what happened in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and then later in Genesis chapter 10, and then in Deuteronomy 13, when the sons of God came and had children with the daughters of men. They thought that was really important. And when the sons of God, who God had put over the nations, like we talked about last week, rebelled against God, they thought that was really, really important. And we can find that in Enoch. And so next week, to answer y'all's questions, I'm going to take those passages from Enoch and show you exactly how they connect with certain things in the New Testament, with the understanding that it's not scripture, so you don't have to believe it. And I think it helps explain a lot of things that are really confusing when we can see that.